It's 40 minutes past 6. Manufacturers are still in a state of shock after Honda's decision to close its plant in Swindon. It could cost 7,000 jobs. Here's Dominic with that and the rest of the business news.
Yes, 3,500 at the plant itself, and according to Honda, another 3,500 at suppliers which are dependent on the Swindon plant for all or nearly all of their sales. Well, what next for all those workers? Well, first of all, let's just step back a bit and have a look at Honda's decision. It said that Brexit had nothing to do with it. It was down to bigger forces shaping the car market. Christian Statler is Professor of Strategic Management at Warwick Business School. Christian, do you accept that explanation that really it wasn't down to Brexit, but to much bigger things?
So what I accept is that Brexit is not the only factor, but I do think it was one of the important factors, possibly the tipping point. If you think back to the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher invited Japanese manufacturers to come to Britain, her selling point was that the UK is going to be their entry point to the single market.
But, of course, the chief executive of Honda went out of his way yesterday, said this was not Brexit related. It's to do with our need to invest in electric vehicles and to concentrate production where we have high volumes, and that is not Swindon.
Yes, so that is true, yeah. But likewise, Honda was very vocal prior to this decision that Brexit is something that they're very worried about. So true enough, yeah, and it might have been that, a few years from now, a similar decision would have been reached. But the fact is that right now, Honda has to take decisions because they're entering a new investment cycle. They do know that there's a Japanese-EU trade deal where they will have no tariffs importing cars from Japan to the European market, whereas they don't know what's going to happen from the UK and trying to send cars to Europe.
On the other hand, it's also true to say they didn't know that the future relationship between the UK and the EU, so perhaps maybe that is an argument that Brexit wasn't involved. But following your line of reasoning through from that when Margaret Thatcher first got the Japanese manufacturers involved here, if that rationale for being here is gone, then what future do you think the other big Japanese car plants have here? The Nissan one in Sunderland and, of course, at Burnaston, Toyota.
Well, we already had Nissan scaling back, making one decision that takes investment away. And, there is, of course, still waiting time. I think Toyota takes a big decision next year on whether to reinvest, and we'll have to see what happened in terms of a deal by then. In the short term, if there is a hard Brexit deal, I'm very worried about car manufacturers in the UK in general. And they have been very outspoken. Ralph Spade from JLR has been probably the loudest
chief executive of Business West.
Industry have all voiced their big concerns.
Thank you very much. Christian Statler from Warwick Business School. Well, Swindon, of course, has been a manufacturing hub for a long time before Honda arrived in the 1980s. There was always the Swindon Works, giant railway engineering centre. It's now a shopping centre, a designer outlet, actually. Well, what next for Swindon? Phil Smith is the Chief Executive of Business West, the organisation that helps foster new businesses in the west of England. Phil, what effect did Honda have on the town, on Swindon, when it arrived in the 1980s?
Yeah, Swindon did suffer a large shock in about 86, as you said, when the railways closed. And but by then, Swindon was picking itself up a bit. People like Honda arrived as a big boost, followed by some big tech companies about the same sort of time, Motorola, Lucent, Intel, and then more recently again followed by people at Nationwide. So Swindon is a remarkably adaptable workforce. So
interesting you say Nationwide. Nationwide is actually the biggest employer in Swindon, isn't it? 4,000 as opposed to Honda's 3,500.
Yeah. I think Nationwide probably more than that now. But as you say, with manufacturing, there's a big kick on the tail of supply chain and the associated people. So we are really concerned of what's happened to Swindon, but I am confident that Swindon, like in the late 80s, can bounce back from this position.
Do you think there's any chance of another large single manufacturing employer arriving, another Honda, as it were? Honda replaced the railway works. Will there be another Honda in its place?
I think given the kind of the uncertainty around Brexit at the moment, I can't see that happening in the next few months, that's for sure. But skill shortages are huge in this part of the world. We've got a fantastic growing tech sector around this part of the world that demands skills at the moment. So I'm rather hoping we can, with the adaptable workforce, train some of those really talented Honda associates into maybe tech coders this time around.
You talk to companies that are looking at investing in the UK all the time, I'm sure. What makes the difference? Why would they choose to come to Swindon rather than, say, to go to Germany or France?
Well, notwithstanding the Brexit issues, which I won't go over, but Swindon is fantastically located, and particularly east-west. It's 40 minutes from Heathrow, one of the world's largest airports. It's an hour from central London. that adaptable skilled workforce that is there, and lots of them at the moment, unfortunately. Housing is cheap, relatively affordable. It's a good place. It's an attractive, well located, a town that can cope and will cope, I'm sure.
But given recent history, it's more likely that the next big employer in that part of the world is going to be a services company, an Intel or a Motorola or a Vodafone, rather than a manufacturing company.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. I think yes. I entirely agree with your last reporter about why Honda have left. It is market driven, but Brexit played some uncertainty factors in it. That's going to exist as long as we don't sort out this mess.
Thank you very much, Phil Smith, Chief Executive of Business West. Companies are starting to report the difference between how much they pay men and women. BBC research on the first set of returns show that in many cases, perhaps two-fifths of all the cases, the gender pay gap is getting worse, not better. Rebecca Hilsenrath is Chief Executive of